The FDA set to meet today to discuss vaccine boosters for the general public and decide whether or not to recommend a third dose of the Pfizer vaccine. And joining us now, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, former FDA commissioner and a CNBC contributor. He also serves on the boards of Pfizer and Illumina. And his new book, Uncontrolled Spread, Why COVID-19 Crushed Us and How We Can Defeat the Next Pandemic, is out Tuesday. We're still trying to defeat this pandemic, Doctor. Would you be speculating that if I were to ask you to go behind the scenes at the FDA, CDC, and Biden administration and just explain exactly what's going on and where the parties are in terms of disagreeing with one another on boosters, and what's causing it and what finally happens?
Well, look, there's general concern of declining effectiveness of the vaccines for people who were vaccinated a long time ago, particularly older individuals who are more vulnerable to COVID. There's data out of Israel showing a pronounced decline in some segments of the population, particularly older individuals who were vaccinated 8 or 9 months ago. And that's compelling some public health officials inside the administration to want to pursue boosters, at least for some portion of the population. The FDA Advisory Committee today is being asked to opine on that. Objectively, they're being asked to determine whether or not the boosters are safe and effective. The evidence of safety, the data on safety coming out of Israel, seems to demonstrate that the safety profile of the vaccine of the third dose is consistent with the second dose. And so you would conclude from that it's safe, or so it's within the bounds of what we expect from the vaccine. The second question of whether or not it's effective, the data out of Israel published this week showed that in an older population in particular, where the boosters were administered first, you saw a marked increase in immune protection, an 11-fold increase in protection against infection, a 19-fold increase in protection against symptomatic disease and severe disease. Now, this was over a short period of time because Israel just started administering their boosters, but you would conclude that there's evidence of effectiveness. I think the FDA advisory panel today, though, is going to go beyond that narrow construction and start to explore questions of which groups could be benefiting from these boosters. And when you start to ask that question, you start looking across the age spectrum, and there is more pronounced evidence of benefit in older individuals and younger individuals because the boosters haven't been administered to a younger population until more recently in Israel, and they haven't been administered to a younger population in the UK. And the immune decline that we're seeing in the studies, and where we're seeing evidence of breakthrough infections, is generally among older individuals who are more vulnerable to the infection. So the question is, does the advisory committee stick to the narrow construction of the question, or do they look more expansively at some of the public health contours? And I think they're likely to do the latter and, wade into territory that's also going to be explored by the CDC when they take up this question.
Well, or would that mean that the FDA would be not reversing their previous stance, but at this point, what's with the? We're hearing that that these different agencies are not in agreement with each other. Why is the FDA where it is right now versus the administration?
Well, look, I think the public health debate right now is whether or not the vaccines are doing their job. So the evidence that we have is that there is a rising incidence of breakthrough infections. Most of this evidence is coming out of Israel and the UK because we're actually not tracking it here in the US. So when we criticize the data that's being evaluated, we ought to ask ourselves why the CDC isn't systematically tracking this. But there is evidence of breakthrough infections. But the evidence on whether or not those breakthrough infections are translating into symptomatic and severe disease and hospitalizations, it doesn't seem to suggest that. The data on hospitalizations seems to suggest that the vaccines are still holding up, even in older individuals vaccinated a while ago, greater than 90% effectiveness against hospitalizations. And with respect to symptomatic disease and severe disease, there are some studies that suggest that the immune protection is declining in older individuals vaccinated a long interval ago. Some studies suggesting it could be as low as 65%, but others show that the protection is holding up between 80 and 90%. So the data is mixed there. So the question for public health officials is, should we be administering boosters when the vaccines are still fulfilling their original premise, which is that they're going to protect you from dying from COVID, they're going to protect you from getting severely ill from COVID? I think, in my view, the answer to that question is that in an older population vaccinated a while ago, there is clear evidence that the boosters can provide additional benefit. We know that population is uniquely vulnerable to COVID. And to the extent that we're seeing rising breakthrough infections and some rising incidence of more severe disease, that's concerning. You worry that that is sort of the tip of the iceberg, and you're going to start to see more and more older people become vulnerable. And so I think we're likely to come out here is some recommendation around providing boosters, but bifurcating it based on age and people's circumstance. Now, how the FDA would back into that, I'm unsure. They could come out with a general recommendation that boosters are recommended for certain portions of the population, have a discussion about what they think those portions of the population are, but largely leave it up to ACIP, the advisory committee to CDC, to define what that population is. And I think ACIP, given what we've heard out of CDC, is likely to define it based on age.